At 67 years old, I came home from open-heart surgery to an empty airport curb, and before the sun went down that same day, my son was pounding on my front door with his phone shaking in his hand, demanding to know why the hospital had just erased his name from every document tied to my care. My daughter-in-law had told me that morning to call a rideshare. My son had asked why I never plan ahead. Neither of them asked if the surgery went well. Neither of them asked if I was afraid. But 3 weeks earlier, quietly, without telling either of them, I had already decided who would matter to me going forward, and that decision was about to detonate in the middle of their carefully scheduled lives. I want to tell you exactly how a woman with a healing heart and a locked phone spent one afternoon teaching her family a lesson 15 years of silence had failed to teach them. My name is Adeline Marchetti, and for most of my adult life, I believed love meant making myself small enough to fit into other people's calendars. I raised my son, Trevor, on my own after his father left when Trevor was 9 years old. I worked double shifts at a fabric warehouse and a dry cleaning counter so he could play travel baseball, so he could take the school trip to Washington, so he never once had to feel like the boy whose mother couldn't keep up with the other families. When Trevor grew into a contracts attorney with his own office downtown, I was prouder than I had words for. When he married Kimberly Marsh, a sharp, driven woman working in regional operations for a pharmaceutical distribution company, I welcomed her the way I'd always hoped to welcome a daughter. The early years were warm. Sunday dinners, photos taped to my refrigerator, Kimberly calling to ask for recipes she said her own mother never had time to teach her. Then the children came, a boy named Wesley and a girl named Ava, and somewhere between diaper bags and preschool wait lists, I stopped being a mother-in-law and quietly became a resource. A permanently available one. I drove across town at 5 in the morning when Kimberly had early flights for regional audits. I picked the children up from school more days than their own parents combined. I sat through band recitals on gymnasium bleachers that left my knees aching for a week. I kept Wesley and Ava overnight so often that my guest bathroom had their toothbrushes sitting in a cup by the sink, like it was simply understood that this was mine to carry. I never once asked for a thank you. I only wanted, quietly, to matter to them. I remember one particular Tuesday 3 years ago, standing in the school pickup line for the 4th time that week because Kimberly had back-to-back client calls and Trevor had a deposition running long. Ava climbed into my back seat, buckled herself in without being asked, and said, "Grandma, you're always the one who comes." She said it so simply, the way children say true things without understanding the weight of them, that I laughed and told her of course I'm always the one who comes. That's what grandmothers do. I didn't hear the second half of that sentence back then. The part that should have worried me. Always the one who comes implies someone else has quietly stopped trying. But somewhere along the way, I stopped noticing something important. The favors stopped being favors and became expectations, and expectations, when nobody corrects them, harden into entitlement. I told myself family didn't need a scoreboard. I was wrong about that. Family still needs boundaries. Without them, you eventually become furniture that occasionally cooks dinner. 6 months ago, my cardiologist looked at my test results and got quiet in the particular way doctors get when the news carries weight. My heart had a structural weakness that had likely been building for years, possibly since a virus I barely remembered having in my 40s. Left alone, I had maybe 2 years before something catastrophic happened. Treated, with a newer reinforcement procedure being trialed at a specialized cardiac center in Cleveland called the Lindenmeyer Heart Institute, my chances were good. Not guaranteed. Good. I told Trevor and Kimberly I needed a minor outpatient procedure. I chose that word on purpose, and I watched Kimberly's expression when I said it, a flicker of relief that told me she wouldn't need to rearrange anything on my account. I told myself I was protecting them from worrying. The truth is less generous than that. I was protecting myself from confirming, in advance, that they wouldn't rearrange anything even if they knew the full picture. There is a strange kind of mercy in not testing people you already suspect will fail the test. I flew to Cleveland alone. I signed consent forms with phrases like cardiac arrest risk and possibility of non-survival delivered in the same, even tone a waiter uses to describe a lunch special. The night before surgery, I called Trevor from my hospital bed, and when he asked how I was feeling, I told him I was just tired and that he should get some rest, because Ava had a dance recital the next morning, and I didn't want to be the reason he missed it. I did not tell him I might not wake up. There is a particular loneliness in lying awake the night before major surgery in a city where nobody in your family knows your room number. I remember staring at the ceiling tiles, counting the small water stains, thinking about how strange it was that I had spent 15 years memorizing my grandchildren's school schedules, their allergy lists, their favorite cereal, and yet in the one hospital that mattered most, not a single person on the other end of that family group chat could have told you which floor I was on. Rosalind knew. Rosalind had flown in 2 days earlier, sat in the vinyl chair beside my bed, and asked me question after question the way a sister does when she's trying to make up for 20 lost years in one visit. She was the one who made the nurses laugh. She was the one who held my hand until the sedative pulled me under. The surgery lasted 6 hours. When I opened my eyes, a nurse named Priscilla was holding my hand because no one else was in the room to do it. She stayed 20 minutes past the end of her shift. She told me later she often did that for patients whose families, in her words, got the timing wrong. I have turned that phrase over more than almost anything else this year. Got the timing wrong. As though my family's absence was a scheduling error rather than a decision they made without noticing they'd made it. I spent 3 weeks recovering nearby, walking slow laps down a beige hallway with a nurse's aide beside me, sending updates to the family group chat that received roughly the amount of concern you'd give a weather forecast. Somewhere in those 3 weeks of quiet, I did a great deal of thinking. And before I ever boarded the flight home, I had already made one decision I felt completely certain about. On my second to last day at the Institute, a hospital administrator named Deborah Wickham sat with me to finalize my discharge paperwork, and she asked the standard question every recovering patient gets asked. Is there someone you'd like listed as your emergency contact and care correspondent going forward? Someone we should keep informed if anything changes. For 15 years, the automatic answer would have been Trevor. He was my son. He was the attorney. He was on paper already my listed contact from an authorization I'd signed years earlier and honestly forgotten still existed. But somewhere in those 3 weeks of healing with nobody beside me, I had asked myself a question I should have asked long before this hospital bed. If something happened to me tonight, who would actually show up without being asked twice? The honest answer wasn't Trevor. It hadn't been Trevor in longer than I wanted to admit. I gave Deborah a different name. My younger sister, Rosalind, someone neither Trevor nor Kimberly had heard me speak of in 15 years, because I'd never needed to explain that I still had one. Rosalind and I had a falling out decades ago over our mother's estate, the kind of rift families let calcify into permanent silence simply because reconciling feels harder than staying angry. But 2 years earlier, quietly, without telling anyone in Trevor's household, Rosalind and I had started speaking again. She was the one who flew out to see me privately before the surgery. She was the one who sat with me the night before, the only person who actually understood what minor procedure was code for. I asked Deborah to update my files so that going forward, all care correspondence and any documentation requiring a listed contact would route to Rosalind instead of Trevor. Deborah explained, plainly, that once my discharge was finalized, their system would automatically send a notice to whoever had been the previous primary contact, informing them the designation had changed. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a legal severing of anything Trevor owned a right to. It was simply the truth, delivered the way hospitals deliver most truths, through paperwork and a follow-up email. I didn't do this out of spite. I did it because I had finally answered my own question honestly, and the honest answer required action, not just quiet disappointment. My flight landed in Atlanta a little after 1 in the afternoon. I sat in my window seat while the cabin rose around me in that particular chaos of overhead bins and impatient elbows, and for a moment I simply watched a young father lift his sleeping daughter onto his shoulder, the kind of easy tenderness that used to be ordinary in my own life. I made my way slowly off the plane, my chest tight where the stitches pulled with every breath, a hospital wristband hidden beneath my sleeve because some tired part of me still didn't want to look like a burden, even now. At the pickup curb, I opened the family group chat. My flight lands at 1 p.m. Can someone pick me up? I watched the message sit there. 1 minute. 3 minutes. 7. I could see both of them had read it. The silence beneath their names felt heavier than the traffic idling beside me. At 1:09, Kimberly answered. We're busy today. Just call a rideshare. Then Trevor. Why don't you ever plan ahead, Mom? I sat on a bench near baggage claim with my discharge folder pressed against my ribs, and a pill bottle in my bag warning me not to lift more than 10 pounds, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that I had spent 15 years building a life around people who had never once considered building a single afternoon around me. I typed one word back. Okay. Then I called a rideshare, and a kind driver named Walter noticed the wristband slipping from beneath my sleeve and carried my suitcase before I could pretend I was capable of lifting it myself. Ma'am, he said gently, you just get in. I've got this. That small kindness from a stranger nearly undid me in a way my own family's silence hadn't managed to. Walter didn't ask questions the whole drive. He just glanced back once in the mirror and said, You take care of yourself now, all right? Somebody ought to be doing that for you. I told him I would try. I meant it more than he probably realized. I watched the city pass by the window, familiar streets I'd driven 1,000 times to pick up children who weren't mine to carry the way I carried them anyway, and I felt something settle in me that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief. It was closer to clarity, the kind that only arrives after you've been disappointed in exactly the way you privately expect it to be. The rideshare pulled up to my house around 4 that afternoon. My phone had stayed quiet the entire ride home. Then, right as we turned onto my street, it started buzzing without stopping. It turned out that the Lindenmeyer Heart Institute's automated system had sent Trevor an email notification an hour earlier, informing him that his standing designation as my primary care contact had been updated per my request. Trevor, being an attorney, understood immediately what that meant in practical terms, and being Trevor, his first reaction wasn't concern. It was alarm about what he'd lost. By the time I stepped through my front door, my phone showed dozens of missed calls, and the newest message from Trevor read, Mom, answer me right now. What did the hospital just send me? Why does it say Aunt Rosalind is your contact now? I sat down slowly in my reading chair, the same chair I'd sat in through 3 winters of grading Trevor's homework decades earlier, and I let the phone ring twice more before I picked it up. Mom! His voice cracked with something between panic and confusion. I got an email from the hospital. It says my authorization was updated. It says everything's going through Rosalind now. We haven't spoken to her in 20 years. What is going on? I let the silence sit there for exactly as long as he'd let mine sit at the airport that morning. You didn't ask if the surgery went well, Trevor, I said finally. You asked why I don't plan ahead. So I planned ahead. I planned for a version of my life where the people I actually needed weren't too busy to show up. Mom, that's not fair. Kimberly and I were swamped. We had Ava's recital, I nearly didn't survive that operation, I said quietly, because I only intended to say it once. I was alone in another state for 3 weeks, and the only messages I got from either of you were about timing my arrival around your afternoon. So I did some planning of my own. There was a long pause. I could hear Kimberly's voice in the background, sharp and urgent, asking what I'd told him. You can't just cut us out of decisions like that, Trevor said, his voice rising now, less frightened, more indignant, which told me everything about what he'd actually been afraid of losing. Not me, the authority. I didn't cut you out of a decision, Trevor. I removed you from an emergency you didn't show up for. Those aren't the same thing. 2 days later, Kimberly appeared at my door without calling first, something she had never once done in 15 years of careful scheduling. She stood on my porch in her work blazer, holding a folder of her own, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked less like a woman managing logistics and more like someone who had just discovered the ground could shift underneath her. Adeline, she said, there's a letter from your estate attorney. It says you've restructured the trust. It says the fund we've been counting on for the kids' schooling has been changed. I invited her in because whatever else had happened, I still believed people deserved a real conversation rather than a doorway ambush. I didn't touch a cent of Wesley and Ava's education fund. I told her once we were seated. It's fully protected, exactly as it was. What I removed was the clause letting you and Trevor draw against my broader estate for personal expenses while I'm still alive to have an opinion about my own money. That provision existed for real emergencies. Somewhere along the way, it became a line of credit you assumed would always be sitting there without a conversation. You're punishing us because we couldn't drop everything on one day, Kimberly said, her jaw tight. I'm not punishing anyone. I'm noticing a pattern, I said. 15 years of 5 a.m. drives and overnight stays in bleacher seats, and the 1 week I needed a fraction of that back, the answer was a rideshare app. That's not one bad day, Kimberly. That's what 15 years actually looked like, the moment I finally needed something in return. We would have come eventually, she said, quieter now. Eventually isn't the same as when someone needs you, I said. I learned that lesson from watching how quickly I always came for you. She left without the resolution she'd hoped for, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't feel guilty about disappointing her. I sat alone in my kitchen afterward for a long time, turning the conversation over in my mind. Part of me expected to feel triumphant, or at least satisfied, the way you might expect to feel after finally saying the thing you've swallowed for years. Instead, I mostly felt tired, the particular exhaustion that comes from finally being honest with someone who was counting on you not to be. I thought about all the times I'd driven across town at dawn without a single complaint, and how none of that generosity had ever been dishonest. I meant every bit of it. What I hadn't understood until that hospital bed in Cleveland was that generosity without boundaries doesn't read as love to the people receiving it. It reads as availability, and availability, once assumed, stops looking like a gift at all. A week later, my sister drove 3 hours to see me, the same drive she'd made before my surgery, when no one else had made the trip at all. You know Trevor's going to keep pushing on this, Rosalind said, setting a bag of groceries on my counter because she remembered, even after 2 decades apart, that I never keep enough food in the house when I'm not feeling well. Let him push, I said. I'm not taking anything that isn't mine to redirect. I'm simply done being the only person in this family whose time apparently doesn't count. Rosalind studied me for a moment, the way sisters do when they're deciding whether to say something difficult. You know this isn't really about the money, she said. Trevor isn't scared of losing an inheritance. He's scared of finding out he isn't who he thought he was. The good son, the responsible one. That email proved otherwise, and people fight hardest when the truth threatens the story they've built about themselves. She was right, and it was the kind of right that didn't need arguing, only acknowledging. For 15 years I had been the evidence that Trevor was a devoted son because I quietly did all the devoted things on his behalf. The moment I stopped, the illusion collapsed, and his anger wasn't really at me. It was at the mirror I'd accidentally held up. Rosalind stayed the whole weekend, and we spent most of it doing ordinary things, sorting through old photographs, cooking a pot roast the way our mother used to, talking late into the evening about the 20 years we'd lost to a disagreement neither of us could even fully explain anymore. It struck me how easily we'd both let that silence continue simply because neither of us wanted to be the one to break it first. I wondered, not for the first time, how much of my relationship with Trevor and Kimberly had followed the same quiet logic. Nobody ever officially decided I mattered less. It simply became easier, year after year, not to ask for anything, until asking felt like an imposition instead of a right. Before Rosalind left, she hugged me at the door and said, "I'm glad the hospital finally gave you a reason to stop being so patient." I laughed because it was true, and because it was the kind of thing only a sister who'd known you your whole life could say without it sounding cruel. 3 weeks after I came home, Trevor requested a formal meeting with my attorney present, apparently believing this would make the conversation feel less personal and more procedural. I agreed, mostly because I wanted witnesses to whatever came next. He arrived in a suit, the kind he wore to depositions, and I understood immediately he intended to argue his case rather than simply talk to his mother. "This trust restructuring is going to create real problems," he said, sliding a folder across the table. The kids' school has payment deadlines tied to the old structure. Kimberly and I budgeted around distributions we believed were still available. My attorney, a calm woman named Ingrid Solano, glanced at me before responding, but I raised a hand gently to answer for myself. Trevor, I want to be very clear, I said. The Children's Education Fund hasn't been touched. It's fully funded and fully protected, exactly as it always was. What changed is that you and Kimberly can no longer draw against my personal estate for everyday expenses without a conversation first. That provision was meant for emergencies. It quietly became something else, and neither of you ever mentioned it to me directly. We have expenses, Trevor said. The house, the kids' activities, Kimberly's car payments. I nearly died on an operating table 3 states away, I said, and I kept my voice level because I had promised myself I wouldn't raise it, not once through any of this. And the response from my only son was a complaint about my flight timing. I'm not upset that you were busy, Trevor. People get busy. I'm heartbroken that after 15 years of being available for every version of busy you ever had, it never once occurred to you that I might eventually need the same thing back. The room went quiet. Ingrid didn't fill the silence, and neither did I. I let Trevor sit inside it the way he'd once let my message sit unanswered at that curb for 9 full minutes. I didn't realize it was that serious, he finally said, quieter now. You told us it was minor. I said minor because some tired part of me already expected exactly what happened would happen if I told the truth, I said. And I was right. That should worry you far more than any trust document does. He didn't have an answer for that. For the first time in the meeting, he looked less like an attorney and more like a son who had just heard something he couldn't file away or argue around. There was a long silence before he spoke again, and when he did, his voice had lost the courtroom edge entirely. You know why I never wanted to hear that it was serious, he said. Dad left when things got hard. I was 9. I decided a long time ago that if I just stayed organized enough, busy enough, in control enough, nothing bad would actually happen to the people I loved. If I didn't ask how serious it was, it couldn't be that serious. It was the most honest thing Trevor had said to me in years, and it explained more about the last 15 years than any apology could have. He hadn't been avoiding me out of laziness. He built a version of responsibility that only worked if nothing ever actually went wrong, and the moment something did, he didn't know how to show up inside that fear instead of managing around it. I understand that, Trevor, I said gently, but understanding it doesn't undo it. You were 9 when your father left, and that wasn't your fault. You are 41 now, and how you respond to the people who need you is entirely yours to decide. He nodded, and for once, he didn't try to argue his way out of the silence that followed. Kimberly reached out again a month later, alone this time, asking to meet for coffee instead of showing up unannounced. She looked tired in a way I recognized, the particular exhaustion of someone quietly recalculating a version of herself she hadn't examined in years. I've been replaying that day at the airport, she said. The message I sent. I keep thinking about how easy it would have been to just say yes. It would have been, I agreed. I don't have an excuse that makes it better, she said. I was tired, it was a busy week, and none of that matters, because you just had heart surgery and I told you to call a car. I appreciated the honesty more than I expected to. It didn't undo anything, but it mattered. I'm not interested in punishing you forever, Kimberly, I said. But I am interested in a relationship where I'm not the only one keeping track of who shows up. If that's something you and Trevor genuinely want to build, I'm here for it. If it's something you want to say you want while quietly going back to exactly how things were, I think we both already know how that ends. She nodded slowly, and for the first time since I'd known her, she didn't offer a plan or a schedule or a fix. She simply sat with the discomfort of having been wrong, which was, in its own way, more honest than anything she'd said to me in 15 years. The first Sunday dinner after the meeting was quieter than usual. Trevor showed up early, actually early, carrying a dessert he'd picked up himself, instead of asking me to have something ready. Wesley ran straight to me and wrapped both arms around my waist, careful, like someone had told him to be gentle, and I realized Kimberly must have explained to the children, in whatever simple terms felt appropriate, that Grandma had been sick and needed softer hugs for a while. Ava sat beside me at the table and asked, out of nowhere, "Grandma, were you scared in the hospital?" I looked at Trevor before I answered, and something passed between us, an unspoken agreement that the children deserved a version of the truth the adults in the family had avoided giving each other for months. "A little, sweetheart," I said. "But I'm here now, and that's what matters." "I'm glad you're here," she said, and went back to her plate like she hadn't just said something that undid me quietly for the rest of the evening. Later, washing dishes side by side, Trevor said, "I keep thinking about how close I came to not really understanding any of this until it was too late to fix." I told him understanding it now still counted for something. It didn't erase the airport curb, but it wasn't nothing either. It has been 8 months since I came home to an empty pickup curb and a phone that wouldn't stop ringing once it finally started. Trevor and I speak differently now. He picks up Wesley and Ava from school most days himself. He calls to ask how I'm feeling before he asks me for anything at all, and I notice the difference every single time, because noticing is the thing I failed to do for 15 years. Kimberly and I are careful with each other now, rebuilding something slower and more honest than what we had before, which I've come to believe is worth more than the comfortable illusion we maintained for so long. Rosalind and I talk every week. 20 years of silence, undone by a hospital bracelet, and one decision I almost talked myself out of making. I still keep the trust the way I restructured it, not out of anger anymore, but out of self-respect, because I finally understand that boundaries aren't punishment. They're the terms under which love gets to remain sustainable instead of one-sided. I think about that bench at the airport often, the one where I sat with a healing heart and a silent phone, surrounded by strangers who all had someone coming for them. I didn't have that on that particular day, but I built a version of my life afterward where I finally do. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd never made that call to Deborah, if I'd let the old paperwork stand and gone right back to being the person everyone assumed would always show up no matter what. I think about the version of me who quietly absorbed that airport afternoon, who let it become one more thing filed away under things I forgive because I love them anyway. That version of me existed for a long time, and she was tired in a way I don't think anyone around her ever noticed, because she never let them see it. I'm not angry anymore, not the way I was in those first few weeks. What I feel now is closer to relief. Relief that I finally trusted myself enough to act on what I already knew, instead of waiting for one more disappointment to confirm it. If you found out your family had quietly moved on without you the exact moment you needed them most, would you have gone back to how things were? Or would you have done exactly what I did?